Welcome to another podcast of In Other Words with Way. I'm your host, Wayman Hall, and I want to just jump right into it. First of all, I'm doing this podcast because I believe it is extremely important. I cannot emphasize more than how pertinent this time is that we're living in. Here in 2020, definitely the craziest year in my 40 years on this earth, but I would argue that probably the craziest year since before World War II. And to be honest with you, I think it's very, very, very important that we, and myself, that's what I'm trying to do with this, we as a society communicate, inform ourselves, and figure out what we want to do with this here democracy, where we want it to go, and how we want to set up society in the future so that we can have less income inequality, more chances at moving up or pulling yourself up by your proverbial bootstraps, which really doesn't make sense. However, that's the game. I think that we all would agree that a more egalitarian or a more equal society is the aim for all people. Now, I get it. There will always be an elite class, and that's been since the beginning of time. That makes sense. I'm not saying some type of Stalinist communism where the government owns everything and distributes out every little peanut equally amongst everyone. That doesn't make sense. However, there are different forms of socialism that I would argue come a lot closer to creating the society I believe we would all like to live in. I'd want to start off by saying Netflix right now. Matter of fact, turn this podcast off and go watch the new documentary on Netflix. It's called Capitalism in the 21st Century. I believe it's based on a book by a Frenchman named, Thomas Piketty. He wrote a book that this documentary is based on. It also follows along the similar lines to another book that I've been reading, or I've just finished reading, by Sarah Chayes called On Corruption in America. Very good book, great documentary. Listen, take the time. It's so much bullcrap to watch on Netflix. Take the time to sit down, put on your nerd cap, get you some popcorn, and inform yourself. Watch it twice. Go slowly through it. Watch this podcast. Give me some questions and some different things you would like to discuss. But I'm going to start by saying, please go watch that, because the information on there is pertinent to the times that we're living in. So I want to say certain things that make this time important to inform ourselves. The reason why is because I believe that because of the inequality, we see so much vitriol and hate and nationalism and fascism and racism and all these different isms rising up now in the streets of America, but in the streets all across the world, because of the way that the inequality has been rising exponentially in the past 40 years, my lifetime pretty much. This is not the first time that it's happened. So I think that's why it's very important for us to go take a look at our history and past, because this is not unprecedented times. The precedent has been set on multiple occasions in human history. So I'd argue that this is similar to right before World War I in 1914, when the inequality gaps were almost exactly as they are now. But before we get into that, let's look back at kind of where all this started from. Okay, so if we look back as the Americas were being created in the 18th and 19th century, that's the 1700s and the 1800s, you have a nobility class in Europe. You have a aristocracy. You have nobles, kings, queens, knights, people that are born into positions of privilege just by right of their birth. Just flipping a coin, you're born to this family, you're rich. You're born to this family, you're a peasant, you're a serf, and you have no way of moving up, no way of gaining capital. Okay? Capital is wealth. Capital is our assets or money that is owned by a person. So in these societies, in these aristocracies of Europe, there was no way of gaining capital except if you were a landowner. Landowning and money lending were the main two ways of gaining capital, along with inheritance and marriage. So you see rich people marrying rich people and poor people being stuck to be in the same messed up position, lower life expectancy, and much harder way of life with no hope or chance for the future, period. And in these times, that really the further and further the gap between the haves and the have-nots, you end up in a point where people are so desperate that it ends up in a real life revolution, which we see. We see in one of the powerhouses of Europe in what I think was 18 something. Let's see, I got it here. Well, anyways, the French Revolution happened. The French Revolution was in 1789, and basically the people rose up and chopped off the heads of the king and queen and went around France, basically killing and uprooting the aristocracy. That's one way of making change. That's not the way that we do it today. I'd argue we could do it through our democracy if we could still come together and form ourselves and use our powers, including the right to vote. A lot of people think your vote doesn't matter, but it only doesn't matter because people are not informing themselves, uniting, and actually creating change through their democratic rights. So if you don't want to be a part of the two-headed snake of Republicans and Democrats and the same damn tail of both of them rattling away, then it's up to us to figure out a third party and a way to get to it, and a way to change things. Maybe a labor party, maybe a way that helps to, dare I say, redistribute the wealth. Redistribution of wealth is a evil term in capitalist America of today, but basically that's what we're going to need to avoid a catastrophic event, possible world war, and just a better future for our children and our grandchildren and our societies around the world. But I'm going to focus mostly in America because that's where I was born and raised. So after the French Revolution in Europe, they went ahead and they chopped off the heads of the aristocracy and started anew. However, they did not put into place a system that was able to create and maintain a more equal, egalitarian society. Very quickly, bankers bend the rules to their favor, and again, as the struggle continued, the wealthy and the elites became more and more powerful, and the distribution of wealth became more and more lopsided towards a smaller and smaller portion of the society. The thing about the elites and the poor is that I completely understand that there have always been elites and there always will be. This isn't a shot at or an arrow towards rich people. This is a more societal idea of what it takes to create a thriving middle class and a more equal society. So you have a struggle between elite people and poorer people, and again, I'm not saying that somehow this needs to be a Stalinist communist state, the dark, evil communist state that literally no one can own anything and everything is owned by the government and then distributed equally amongst the people. We see that that doesn't work, and I don't even think that's the right idea. However, there are other forms of socialism where we can set up a form of government and a society in which people are not squeezed into becoming machines. We see that now. We see the push towards deunionization, weaker unions. We have huge multinational corporations that instead of paying their workers proper vacation, sick time, health benefits, that we see them becoming made into quote unquote independent contractors, such as Uber drivers who work basically for Uber, however, are classified as independent contractors, so they do not receive any health benefits, any vacation, any, paid time off. And it's just basically to squeeze and maximize profits. And so with where we're at now, I gotta say, in terms of the way that I look at societies as a whole, is almost as looking at an individual. I believe as individuals, we all have greed. We all have a degree of racism. We all have certain qualities that we don't like to acknowledge, but must acknowledge that do exist. And in terms of ourselves, the way we carry ourselves, we try not to be racist. We try not to cheat people. We try not to hoard things. We try to be nice, share, help, And I think that's the same ideas of what we need to think about as a society. We want to set up a society that does not allow small groups of individuals to hoard all the resources and all the wealth, all the capital. So that's the type of thing that I'm going to be talking about on this podcast. There's quite a few books I'm going to do, but the idea is that I want to try to break down seemingly difficult issues, bigger words, because as a citizen in the U.S., as a citizen of the world, it's our job to understand things and to figure them out and become a part of the solution. This is not just for, well-educated people or white people or rich people or any type. This is for everyone. And that's the whole thing. If we don't all participate, then we'll end up in the situation that we are in now, in which we need a very, very quick and very quick fix to save our democracy. In terms of talking about individual greed, I thought that in the documentary Capital in the 21st Century, which again, go watch right now on Netflix, they gave an example of a test where experiment with college students where they basically played a game of Monopoly. But before the two people played a game of Monopoly, the rules were set up that one person in this game is going to have an unfair advantage. They are going to be able to use 2 dice to roll, whereas the other person will only use 1 die. They will start off with more money, quite a bit more money at the beginning of the game. And when they pass go, they'll get $200 while the other person will get $100. So they're moving faster on the board because they got 2 dice, basically a huge unfair advantage. And whoever wins is going to start with a coin toss. Whoever wins the coin toss gets to have the unfair advantage. Now, as the game goes on, as you can guess, the people with the unfair advantage become more and more successful and start winning the game and dominating. But as they dominate, they also start to talk a little bit of shit to the other person. They get a little bit louder, more boisterous. They start banging their piece on the table. The number one thing that they do is at the end, when the game is over with and they're asked, well, why do you think you won the game? They'll give answers. Oh, the other person should have did this, or they should have did this, or it was because I did this, or whatever. None of them, literally none of the people said, well, the game was unfair from the beginning. Whoever won that coin toss was going to win the game. And that's kind of where that's how it was in feudal Europe during the times which I talked about with the aristocracy and being born into a caste system of a serf or a peasant or of a nobility of a rich. It's the same thing going on now. If you are born poor, you will die poor. We need to shake the idea that you can just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. It is when you have a power group of elites who literally control our democracy. And that's the problem with democracy. It's the same struggle between haves and have-nots. The haves are always going to try to have more, and the have-nots have to have a system set up, such as democracy, to try to keep the power balance a little bit closer, to have a thriving middle class. If you have a thriving middle class, then it is a sign of a healthy society. It's a society where people can move up, a society where the lowest are not being squeezed. But as we see, our middle class over the last 40 years has shrunk to almost nothing, to just a hair bit better off than the working poor class. And so we need to do something about that. And that's what this is going to be about. We need to do something about it quickly, because as people get more and more starving and hungry and lose their resources, they become more antagonistic towards each other. You would think that people would focus on our checks and balances system, our way of democracy, our way of checking absolute power, our way of breaking up monopolies, our way of setting up different regulations to stop companies from becoming monopolies, and more choice, healthcare, education, the things that people need to be in a functioning, healthy society. Whereas we see privatization, more and more monopolies. Should I name a few? I mean, we have the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons, the Ubers, all of these industries, and food industries. Tyson, which another book I want to shout out real quick. It's called Break 'em Up. And the lady's name who wrote that is Zephyr Teachout. It's called Break 'em Up. It just came out. Another great book. It's all about monopolies, but she points out it with chicken farms and Tyson in the way that they basically monopolize the chicken industry. But it's not just that. It's you see it in all different industries, and it's becoming more and more because regulations have been stripped away over the last 40 years. And if we don't come together and do something about it, it's going to get worse and worse. You'll see the hatred and vitriol, instead of being focused on redistribution of wealth or towards the higher classes and the haves, they very easily, through news media, are able to manipulate us into blaming, say, the migrant workers, different protests, the blacks, the BLM movement. You see the poor white people, getting more and more scared that the immigrants are taking away their opportunities to advance. The idea of make America great again. Well, let's make America better than ever before. There was a time in a lot of the boomers generation, boomers I guess would be 60 and up. In their generation, they saw themselves and their parents were as white Americans, living in the 40s and 50s, or the 50s and 60s, I would say, late 40s, 50s, and 60s, were actually living in a time when America had an unfair advantage and people were actually becoming middle class, having a great life. And that's the idea that Trump plays into with the Make America Great Again. And that's what they see. But obviously, as a black man and as a black people in America, we know America was never great. We need to make America something again, So anyways, that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to use different examples, including your boy Jesus. Yes, Jesus. Oh, my goodness. Jesus Christ. What was man? It was I don't know the scripture. I had written it down, but anyways, one of the most badass things Jesus did in his life, as the Bible tells us, was go into the temple of Jerusalem and kick out the money changers. The same people I'm talking about now, the same elites, the same hoarders, the hoarders of wealth, the hoarders of capital, the hoarders of power. Jesus came in and literally got violent, pulled out a whip. I don't think he whipped anybody, but got to kicking over their tables and kicking them out of the temple. And eventually that's what led to his death. But that's a whole nother podcast. I want to talk about a whole different assortment of things. We're starting with history and kind of how we got to where we are. I'm going to leave it at World War I, which was created because, well, actually, let me say a little bit more before I get out of here. Not only were Europeans able to move to the Americas and get land, which they could not get in Europe because you had to be born into land and there was no way to gain capital. But for the first time, Europeans were able to move to Australia, America. I'm focused on America, and actually go out there. I mean, we were snatching up land from the Native Americans, So, you go, you conquer this territory, and it is yours. Now you are a landowner. Now you have the ability to make money, to obtain wealth, to obtain capital. And the more people you have to work that land, then the more money you can make. Hence slavery, and the way that slavery grew so quickly and so profoundly that you find more black people in Brazil than any other country in the world, including Africa, except for Nigeria. Nigeria is number one with the most amount of black people, and Brazil in South America is the number two country with the highest population of black people. And that's because of the slave trade. And a lot of people don't know. America only got about 5% of the slaves. The rest went to the Caribbean and South America. And the amount, the fact of the amount that that there are in Brazil shows how big and how big it was. And it was all because of capital and capitalism. It was the ability for a white male from Europe, or recently first, second generation American, to go out, conquer land, enslave people, and multiply, gaining wealth to the point where in the 1860s, at the highest point of slavery, the southern states, the Confederate States, were literally the fourth richest economy in the world. And they were contributing to more of the GDP, the total gross domestic product, out the amount of money, the most. Okay, if America is making $500 billion a year, the South was creating 270 million. It was more than the North, and they were the fourth wealthiest of themselves without the North. The South was the fourth largest economy in the world at the heart of slavery, and everybody was getting rich. People were getting rich building the boats, sending the boats to West Africa. The slave traders were getting rich in West Africa, sending them to the Americas, getting rich there. The people who bought the slaves were getting rich from their labor, because slaves were not only assets, but they were laborers. So they were walking assets / laborers. So you had a source of labor and a valuable asset in a slave. And so it took off exponentially to the point where we see how wealthy the South had become at the height of slavery, and why they wanted to hold on to it. Again, I'm not going to go too much further in this one, but please give me a chance. Participate in the conversation. Try, if you look around you and watch the news. See the people in the streets. See the militias. I just saw militias in the middle of St. Louis. Hundreds of armed black people, hundreds and hundreds of armed white people in the streets of America. We see the rioting. We see the uprising. I know that it is a lot of times it's out of sight, out of mind. You just want to get through your day. Now is not the time to do that. Now is the time to be an actual citizen, to participate in this democracy, become a part of this discussion, whether it's with me, whether it's just informing yourself, reading books, listening to Audible books, watching informative documentaries. Again, a shout out to Capital in the 21st Century on Netflix. Go watch. But be a part of it. This is what I'm trying to do. This is me doing my part. Open to suggestions. I'll get better as I go on. Leave me some suggestions. I'd love to have people on. I got the Zoom account, so we can definitely have interviews with multiple people. It's a couch right here. People want to come up and visit and do in person. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna talk about different things. I'm not sure what my next one will be on, but I'll try to keep it going. We'll leave this one off at the nationalism that grew in Europe. Also, I got to throw this in real quick. I know I'm rambling. We had slave labor on an individual basis. A white man buys black slaves. But then we also had colonization of different countries and regions around the world by the main two powers in Europe, which were the UK and France. So imagine the colonization is going around with guns and armies and militias and forcing the people of those areas in the country and their governments to give up their resources for little to nothing, cheap, or take it from them. So it's pretty much, in my view, almost like instead of enslaving one person, enslaving a country or a nation or a large amount of people. So say, for instance, I'm walking around in Libya, making my money, doing my regular thing. I may not have a white man cracking me on the back with a whip, but my money is going up to a person above me that's going up and eventually going to the hands of, I believe it was France that conquered Libya, and to a Frenchman eventually gets the money, and then the money goes back to France. So all around the world you have these different colonies where they are being extorted, and the money, but by force, and the money is going back to Europe, which created a lot of tension in Europe too, because other countries in Europe are watching this go on. I mean, you got Russia, but Germany, who's like, oh, we want a piece of the pie. And then you start having different national issues there. I mean, and then again, you have a huge amount of impoverished people. And then you have an oligarchy, a group of rich, super rich, wealthy, powerful people, which we have today in America. Yes, America, the U.S. has become an oligarchy, a nation controlled by a rich, privileged class. And that's true because we were supposed to have a democracy of our own, but the way that capital has been distributed so far up and so far away from the people, they're able to buy Congress, congressmen, appoint judges. You see our president, and you end up with a system where it's supposed to be democratic and have checks and balances, but a group of very wealthy elite class, an oligarchy, has taken control of our democracy, ladies and gentlemen, and we need to do something about it before we all end up paying for it. Because as you can see, one of the only things that can bring a super, super wealthy, rich, elite person right down to the bottom with you and I is the threat of death, of war, of coronavirus, of the plague. Those type of things make everybody go into their humanity. It doesn't matter how much money you have. We need to stick together to survive. And that's why after World War I and World War II, you see a more of a redistribution of wealth. You see rich people more open to taxation, and you see poor people demanding it, from women to minorities to your average poor Joe Schmo. And again, I can ramble on and on and on, but I'm going to try to keep this one short as possible. Please leave a message, comment. Let's do this. Peace out. Another episode of In Other Words with Way, your host. Love you guys.